passage we will be reading from 2 Thessalonians, the third chapter. There the Apostle Paul writes to the Thessalonians, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teaching you receive from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, and nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. And we did this not because we do not have the right to such help, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. For even while we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. We hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy. They are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. And as for you, brothers and sisters, never tire of doing what is good." Someone was visiting an office building one day, and they noticed there was some different signs on the wall, and one of the signs read, "Work fascinates me. I can sit and watch it for hours." "I don't mind going to work," said another, "but that 8-hour wait to get home is just awful." "Hard work may not kill you," still another said, "but why take the chance?" Yeah, people have all kinds of attitudes toward work, don't they? We've all heard expressions like, a perfect summer day is when the sun is shining and the breeze is blowing and the birds are chirping and the lawnmower is broken. Yeah. What if I were to predict right here and now, folks, that Jesus was going to come back, and he was going to come back tomorrow? You might say, "Well, preacher, you've lost your mind." But even if I have, and I know that's sometimes up for debate, let's take a minute and let's ask that question again. What would you do if you knew that Jesus was going to come back this week? Would you go to work tomorrow? Would you start running around and trying to save everybody you could? Would you change your life? Folks, how Christians have answered that question is interesting, because it's been done in a lot of different ways over the centuries. Some people, they sold all they had and they moved to a mountain and they waited for the second coming of Jesus, only to discover that eventually they had to climb back down to the real world to figure out what they were going to do with their lives when Jesus didn't show up on cue. And you know what? We can't think that this is just some sort of extreme view that's found only in the early church. Because let's remember, about 15 years or so ago, all kinds of Christians, they were selling their homes and they were cashing in their 401ks and they were moving away from the cities and they were waiting for Jesus to appear when all that craziness went down with Y2K. Remember all that fuss over all that? So folks, as we look to our lesson for today from 2 Thessalonians, such a response, I think, is not the way the Apostle Paul would tell us to live if we knew that Jesus were coming back this week. In fact, Paul would tell us, go to work. He'd tell us, go to school. He'd tell us to continue our lives as Christians. Carry on your responsibilities. Now, of course, let's recognize that with such an outlook that we do face some challenges, because after all, most of us, we don't live our lives as Christians fully as we're supposed to. Let's think about our vision statement that we've been talking about from time to time. It is represented on our vision wheels, which you'll find in your bulletins every week. It reminds us that our goal is to daily to be seeking to turn our earthly minutes into eternal moments. And yet we all know that we fall short of that goal sometimes. Yeah, we put off apologizing to someone that we've wronged, or We put off saying things that truly matter to those that we claim to love, thinking that there always will be tomorrow that we can do that. Sure, if we knew that Jesus was coming back this week, we might think of a few things that we better get around to doing. And yet outside of that, yeah, Paul's answer to us would be that we should continue our daily lives, we should go to work. And yet, perhaps it's difficult to believe, that we should. That we should carry on our lives if we knew that really Jesus was coming back tomorrow. And if so, maybe what we're struggling with is the area of our walk with Christ that we would call our calling, our vocation. And this, I think, is what we get to see this morning taking place in our lesson from 2 Thessalonians. This congregation, they were facing a crisis over the issue of their work, their calling, their vocation. In other words, some of the church members there in Thessalonica, they were refusing to do their fair share of the work. Yeah, I mean, what do you do with folks who refuse to carry part of the load? I mean, isn't it true in every sort of human organization that some people just refuse to do their fair share? Indira Gandhi once said there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who do the work, and there are those who take the credit. Try to be in the first group, she said. There's less competition. I suppose this is why my youngest daughter, Jillian, always hated group projects back when she was in school, because she invariably got stuck in a group with some freeloaders who wouldn't do their fair share. So Jillian, who was this perfectionist, would have to end up doing the lion's share of the work. And folks, here's an interesting little factoid for you that kind of flies in the face of Jillian's experience. It seems amongst the richest countries in the world that we in the U.S., we work the longest hours. Yeah, Americans work much longer than say, the Europeans do. And such a difference is really kind of surprising, because our productivity as Americans per hour worked is actually the same as that we see in countries like Germany and France. And yet in most countries, and in most times in history, it seems, as people have become richer, they've chosen to work less. In other words, they decide to spend a part of their discretionary income on not working, on a fuller private life. Let's take over the last 50 years in Europe. They've continued this pattern. And as a result, hours of work have fallen sharply. But not so much here in the U.S. To the contrary, we appear to choose acquiring things, more things, as opposed to more leisure. And of course, the recent decline, who knows, in the European economy may be related to their more relaxed views on this. But even with all of our American work ethic, let's realize that there are plenty of people in America who seem to avoid doing their fair share. So let me ask you, are there any slackers where you work, in your office? Back to my daughter Jillian, this theme seems to be an ongoing thing in her own personal life, because now, as a high school English teacher, she comes to me regularly and she voices her frustrations with the slackers in her school. And realize she's not talking about the students, she's talking about the other teachers. So it seems that Jillian would get along pretty well with the Apostle Paul, because he was having the same difficulty in the church at Thessalonica. Apparently, some were faithful at the work of serving Christ, while others, not so much. And as for the not-so-muchers, they seem to have a lot of good excuses. Some of them kind of look down on plain everyday work. Maybe it was due to their upbringing. The Jews had been sort of brought up to believe in hard work, yeah, but they also believed that spiritual work was sort of far superior to physical work. They believed that those who sort of studied the scriptures, like the scribes did, were doing worthy work, but not those who were doing manual labor. Well, how about the Greeks? What did they believe? Well, they didn't like work either. They felt that it was demeaning, and so they left most of the work for their servants and their slaves. And then there were those in the Thessalonian church who just plain didn't believe in work because they didn't feel like it was necessary anymore. Because, like Jesus is going to be coming back any day now, so why work? Yeah, the Thessalonians had a lot of excuses for not working, just like people today. Because isn't it amazing how creative people can be in coming up with all sorts of excuses? Abraham Lincoln, it is said, was once asked about the size of the Confederate Army. And he said 1.2 million, rather categorically. You see, he said all generals, when they get whooped, they say that the enemy outnumbers them at least 3 to 1. We have 400,000 men. So the Confederates must have 1.2 million. You see, Lincoln knew that it's human nature to make excuses when our performance isn't up to par. It said that back during World War II, the Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, they would meet for strategy sessions. And at times, Stalin, he wouldn't approve of some strategy, and when the other two would ask him why, he would always come up with some kind of excuse. And with each excuse, Roosevelt and Churchill would reply, I mean, that's no reason to refuse. So finally, Stalin told him a story about 2 Arab men. And it seems that one Arab asked his friend if he could, borrow his rope. His friend said that he was unable to lend him his rope because he needed to tie up his camel. And his friend said, wait a minute, friend, you don't own a camel. To which he replied, yes, I know, but if you don't want to lend your rope to someone, then one excuse is as good as another. Yeah, the members of the church there in Thessalonica had a lot of good excuses, just like you and I sometimes can do when there's work to be done. In fact, isn't it the truth that churches are living testimonies to what is known as Pareto's principle, that 20% of the people end up doing 80% of the work? And that's just human nature. And folks, that's why on this Sunday, when we normally talk about stewardship, before our big harvest dinner, when we bring forth our pledges for the coming year, then instead of focusing just on money, because we've talked a lot about that over the last month, then instead we're choosing to hone in today on another vital aspect of stewardship. Stewardship of our time and our talents. Because to be sure, some among us today, you are that 20% that's responsible for sometimes 80% of the work in the church. I mean, that's why Pam Wicks, she had a couple of our young people doing children's church today because she's over getting the dinner ready. She, I think we could agree, would be in that 20%. And I'm eternally grateful for people like that. We can't go on without folks like that. But it's sort of like what author and pastor Rick Warren once said. He said, do you know what the worst sin is for Christians? It's not adultery. It's not murder. It's not some sort of perversion. God tells us in Revelation 3. He says that it's lukewarmness. no passion. Because these people have the attitude, he says, that God is just one of the things in my life. You know, I've got my social life and my career life. I've got my family life. And over here is a little piece called church. But God says, I love you so much. I made you and created you and planned you and saved you. And I have a place for you in heaven. And then you treat all this with a sort of half-hearted indifference, saying, excuse me, but there's a good TV show on tonight? Jesus said, I would rather have you be hot or cold. Lukewarmness makes me sick to my stomach. Yeah. Certain members of the church in Thessalonica were guilty of lukewarmness. They were refusing to carry their fair share of the burden of the mission of the church. They were what the Old English Standard Version called idlers. They were walking in idleness. And folks, the Greek word that's translated as idleness is ataktos. But the older translations of this word, kind of like what we find in the King James Version, seem to hit a little closer to the mark because they use words like disorderly, unruly. Yeah, that word for idleness, it seems a little too narrow of a focus. We can see this, for instance, in our reading for today from 2 Thessalonians, verse 11. We hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy. They are busybodies, we hear. Yeah, Paul describes such people as walking not as busy bodies, steadily going about the work of the Lord, but as busybodies. The picture is not of someone who's sitting around idly, but of someone who is working at the wrong things. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So Paul says such a walk is at odds with the way that we're supposed to be walking if we want to be pleasing to the Lord. So the word ataktos seems to suggest this idea of walking out of line. And I think it's important for us to understand this morning this translation of this word, especially in light of creation, because a good theology of work always begins in creation, even before we get to chapter 3 in the fall. And why? Because work is not the result of the fall, folks. In other words, we do not work because of sin, so work is not inherently bad. And in fact, work is part of God's good creation. Let's notice again what Paul says in verse 10 of today's lesson. He says, "For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule, that anyone who is unwilling to work shall not eat." Yeah, where did Paul come up with this command? From Genesis chapter 1. Sure, God created the world and everything in it. He worked for 6 days, and when he was done, he called everything good. So just as with God, so Adam and Eve were called also to work. Let's go back to Genesis 1 now. And as we read from Genesis chapter 1, listen. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, work it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then God said, "And I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw what he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. And thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the seventh day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. So let's recognize that this all happens in Genesis 1, not in Genesis 3. So even before the fall, before sin enters the world, God instructed Adam and Eve regarding their service. They were to work for their food. So sin is not the reason why we work. Instead, we're called to work because that's what God did. God created the world by working. And you know, this isn't to say that work isn't difficult now because of sin, folks. According to Genesis 3, sin caused work to be carried on now by the sweat of our brows, which is to say, since sin came into the world, you and I, we're going to have pain and toil and labor and sweat. Work is not going to go the way that we wanted it to. There's going to be thorns and thistles that are going to block our way. Work is going to be hard. And yet, despite all this, I want you to notice what doesn't change from Genesis 1 to Genesis 3. Our work still produces our bread. Yeah. God instructed Adam and Eve and the rest of us that part of our duty in this world is work. So let's tie all this back now to 2 Thessalonians, because remember Paul said that he didn't eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor by the sweat of his brow, he worked. And so that provided the example for the command he gave. If anyone is not willing to work, then let them not eat. But where did he get this command? He got it in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. By the sweat of your brow, you shall eat your bread. But now let's think about a second reason why this background in Genesis 3 is so important. Because you see, Paul didn't just find this command about working from there, but even more, his whole perspective on life and work, folks, it starts there. Let's think of it this way. When God created the world, it was good. It was in order. Everything was as it should be. Work was orderly, and it was ruled by God's instruction. And as long as Adam and Eve followed God's commands, everything went well. There was harmony. There was peace. There was what the Bible calls shalom, which includes not just the absence of conflict, but complete well-being, because everything was ordered rightly as it should be. But then sin enters the world, and Adam and Eve not only break God's commands, but they bring disorder into the creation. It disrupts the peace that was God's original intention. And the sin would bring disorder, unruliness. It was out of line with God's intent. So God is at work immediately there in Genesis 3 to repair the ruin that was brought to his creation, so that once more there could be order, there could be peace. And friends, do you see now how Paul is using this story from the creation, from the fall, as the background for today's lesson? And one of Paul's central points is that God is repairing the ruins of creation through his church, through us. That's why it's so important to see the word for idleness in today's lesson as being more than just about being lazy. There's more at stake here than simply not doing things. Paul is saying to the Thessalonians that they were living out of line with how God wanted them to live. They were disrupting God's work and making things right. They were not living in line with his word. Instead, they were living outside of God's order. No, it wasn't simply that they were not working, but rather they were disrupting the way that things are supposed to be. So Paul was telling them to get back in line with God's order, because one of the central purposes of the church is to demonstrate the reality of the way that things are supposed to be. And they weren't doing that. Their life in the church had created disorder there in Thessalonica, in the body, as well as out in society and culture. And this was a breaking of shalom. So Paul was talking to these people and saying that some of these lukewarm believers were bringing a negative spirit into the fellowship. In other words, they were not only being idle, but they were criticizing those who were working, sort of like backseat drivers. So as we've already indicated, Paul referred to these idlers as busybodies. Or as Warren Wiersbe has said, they had time on their hands and gossip on their lips. Ever known anyone like that? Chuck Swindoll describes such people like this. Busybodies flit from house to house, taking little nectared drops of gossip with them and leaving behind their own residue of irritating pollen. Wow. And then Swindoll adds, there's a vast difference between putting your nose in others' business and putting your heart into their problems. It seems that sometimes the consequences of not serving God or our neighbor is having too much time on our hands. And when that happens, we're tempted to snoop in other people's business. You know, an unknown author said that he met the strangest man one day on his way to church. And here's how he describes him. He said he believed in the Bible, but he never reads it. He said he thought well of the church of which he is a member, but he neither attends or invites others to share in its ministry. He said that a person should be honest with God in money matters, but he never tithes. He said the younger generation needs the Lord, but he doesn't have the time to lead any young people in that direction himself. He said the church needs dedicated Christian members, but he isn't one of them. He offers some constructive criticism to some of the church's workers, but he never works himself. He said the church should do more in ministering to the poor, but he never helps. He's critical of the way the church is run, but never participates. He says he believes in the second coming, but he lives as though the Lord will never return. He says prayer will change things, but he never prays. So he was, said this author, a strange man indeed. But then again, maybe not so strange after all, because people like him are legion in number. Again, Paul calls such people busybodies. Yeah, they're busy, but not with constructive behavior, because what we tend to overlook is that the mind is always active. It's never still. It's either thinking positive or it's thinking negative thoughts. And yeah, a person may have an idle body, but not an idle mind, because we all know that an idle mind is what? The devil's playground. And friends, this is why so many idle persons get into trouble. It's dangerous business to be idle, whether you're a kid on the streets in Holland with nothing better to do than to get into trouble, or you're a church member who, if they focused more on others rather than on themselves, they wouldn't have the time to dwell on negative things. Yeah, too many Christians in Thessalonica had become busybodies. They were poking around in other people's affairs, tattling and gossiping and spreading rumors. And why? Because it's easier being a busybody than it is being a busy body. You know, one of my favorite little books is a book called Life's Little Instruction Manual. A father compiled 511 words of counsel for his son as they prepared and packed him up to send him off for his freshman year in college. And among his suggestions was number 115. Give yourself a year and read the Bible cover to cover. Sound like a good idea, Mark? All right. How about some others? Compliment 3 people every day. Get a dog. Stop blaming others. Eat prunes. Lend only those books that you never care to see again. Avoid any church that has cushions on the pews. Spend less time worrying over who's right and more time over what's right. Keep secrets. And finally, don't gossip. And that's good advice for us all, because any of us, if we don't watch it, we can start becoming busybodies and stop being busy bodies, out serving and giving and loving. So as we wrap up, let's take the youth group that went on a mission trip to Jamaica, and they stopped in this Jamaican elementary school in this classroom, and it was overcrowded, and these poor, unruly children, it was chaos, and they watched the teacher, and they marveled at how she was able to deal with all of this with such love and respect. So they all decided that the only possible way that she could do this was that she must really love being a teacher. But they were surprised when they heard her say, "Oh, I don't come here every day mainly because I love teaching. I come here because I love Jesus, and I see Jesus in every one of these little children." And friends, there's a saint of God who will never be idle, who will never be a busybody. She'll never be among that 80% who want a free ride. No, her body's too busy serving Jesus. And ain't that a lesson that we could all learn from? Pray with me. Father, stewardship is such a big subject, not just about money. It's about everything that we are, everything that you've given us. Challenge us as your people to commit, to be hot or cold, not lukewarm, to not be busybodies because we are idle and we have time on our hands. Cause us, Father, as your servants, as your followers, to be busy about the work that you've called us to do as your people. And all of God's people will say together,